Okay, this video is called Why the Best Writers Are Exiles, and they're also, imprisoned or posthumous. And the reason is because they tell you the truth. In general, I've noticed, for example, I've read tons of medical books. The best books are written by old guys because they don't care anymore. They just tell the truth. They're not worried about their career. They pretty much they've been, frustrated or pissed off because their knowledge has not been able to be shared or widespread. So they just write a book towards the end of their career. It's a legacy book and it's great. And all through history, a lot of the best books have been written by people who are essentially somewhat ostracized, social outcasts. Going back to the ancient Greeks, Herodotus, the father of history, he was half Persian and half Greek, never fully accepted by either one. And he had a unique perspective to understand both. So he wrote about the great uniting of the ancient Greeks that enabled them to defeat the Persians, who vastly outnumbered them in the high 400s before Christ. Thucydides had been fired from the Athenian army that he had screwed up, it was claimed. And he had a unique position to write the Peloponnesian War, about the war between Sparta and Athens, and that's a magnificent book. And he knew, he was an outcast. He was probably not going to get anything for it. So he wrote, one of his quotes was, "I write this simply to serve mankind," as a testimony to what really happened in the Peloponnesian for all time. What I'm trying to say is they do it because they love the subject. And they often don't expect to make 5 cents from these books. They just know they've got something important to say, truthful and useful. Plato was a failed playwright, but that taught him how to write in his conversational dialectic style. He was a political prisoner, almost killed. Okay, he also was very sad. He saw Socrates condemned to death, and he wrote the Republic in almost like a conversational form. It's one of the all-time greatest masterpieces of philosophy. And that style of writing is magnificent. Okay, Aristotle was a Macedonian, and he was not liked very much by many of the Athenians, who resented him. After the death of Alexander the Great, he was forced to flee from Athens, okay? So he was always sort of out of place, but he's one of the greatest, if not the smartest person of all time. Aristotle summarized all the known knowledge of his time. Cicero was the greatest of Romans. He had been exiled from Rome after the persecution of Catiline, where Catiline supporters rose up and chased him out, and he traveled to Greece and he translated books from Greek into Latin. He's the greatest of all Romans, that Cicero. He's amazing. The trilogy about him by, I think it was Robert Harris, is magnificent. John at Patmos, he wrote the book of Revelation. Okay, he's another outcast. John at Patmos Island, outcast, okay. Copernicus wrote his book Posthumous. Boethius, the last great Roman scholar at the collapse of the Roman Empire, wrote his book in prison, Consolations of Philosophy. Some barbarian ruler imprisoned him, and then he died. Okay, Dante's Divine Comedy was written when he was in exile from Florence. Machiavelli had been exiled from Florence politics by the Medicis, and he wrote The Prince, magnificent book about power. Robert Greene's book, the sort of the modern great version of a book about power called The 48 Rules of Power, he said was specifically patterned after what he learned from Machiavelli. Okay, that's a magnificent book. Everybody should read that book too. Tyndale was the great translator of the Bible into English, and he was executed for that, but his translation is the main foundation of most of the translation for the King James Bible. It comes from Tyndale. Okay, he had to flee England. It was considered heresy to put the Bible into the common vernacular language at that time. John Locke lived from 1632 to 1704, wrote Essay on Human Understanding. He had been exiled to the Netherlands, had fled for the safety of his life after having been a critic of the monarchy. He was a champion of freedom. His writing and ideas helped lead to parliamentary rule in England and to the founding fathers in the USA back in 1776 days. Voltaire had been exiled for his smart aleck mouth in France, pissing off the aristocrats. He wrote English letters while in exile. He helped to teach people about Isaac Newton and a comparative study of the cultures between England and France, and those are good. People learn from that. He had a lot of good things to say, Voltaire, like, "I want my doctor to believe in God so he does not rob me." Okay, Goethe published Faust Part 2 posthumously. Tocqueville wrote about America, so he was the French guy who traveled to America around 1835 or so. And he wrote, "To have liberty, one needs morality. To have morality, one needs faith." Will Durant said the same thing. In order to teach morality, you have to teach religion. In order to teach religion, you have to teach people when they're young. Okay? And you really can't have one without the other. You can't have a law-abiding moral country without religion. Victor Hugo wrote Les Miserables. He had been in exile for a long time. It's one of the all-time masterpiece Christian novels. Dostoevsky had been in prison for many years, and that sort of developed him, and he wrote Brothers Karamazov. And here's just a typical quote of Dostoevsky. Even those who renounce Christianity and criticize it, in their innermost being, they still try to follow the Christian ideal. No one has been able to create a higher ideal of man and virtue than that given by Christ. George Orwell had been ostracized from the public sector. He had been wounded in the Spanish Civil War. He was a little bit of a crazy guy when he was young, but he was brilliant, and he learned from his experience. He wrote Animal Farm. He was exiled to the Scottish island of Ura from England. He wrote the book 1984, another magnificent all-time masterpiece, top 20 novels ever written. Ayn Rand had been exiled from Russia. They were terrible to her family and her father. And she wrote Fountainhead and, of course, Atlas Shrugged, one of the all-time top 20 greatest novels. Ann Coulter is pretty much exiled from the mainstream in the USA, and these two women, two great female geniuses, everybody says that they're bitches. Whenever a woman's a genius and she becomes a contrarian, which geniuses do tend to become, they get called bitches, okay? Well, yeah, she's a genius. She's actually very funny. Godless is my favorite of her books, but she's written a lot of really good books. Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote Gulag Archipelago. He himself had been put in a concentration camp in Russia, okay? And it's a magnificent book. He converted to Christianity because he saw how great the Christians were, how impressive they were, that it was the true best religion of mankind. Like Dostoevsky, he also came to the conclusion Russia needs to return to Christianity or it shall be doomed to continuous serfdom and slavery. Communism is just modern slavery. Václav Havel, the Czechoslovakian playwright, he wrote The Power of the Powerless after he'd been pushed out of a lot of things. In terms of the best modern medical books, they all come from people who are, in a sense, exiles ostracized from conventional medicine. Conventional medicine itself hardly does anything useful, but here's some of the great exiles who've written magnificent books. Walter Kempner, John McDougall, Starch Solution, T. Colin Campbell, China Study, Caldwell Esselstyn, Prevent and Reverse Heart Disease, Peter Rogers, MD, The Medical Reformation, and Food, Mood, and IQ. So anyways, there it is. Because the people who are not ostracized that are working for the universities, they tend to be a bunch of conformist kiss-asses just repeating the usual mantra that has some ulterior motive like selling drugs. Okay? The people that tell you the truth are the ones who are ostracized and, they just do it because they're interested in the subject. Anyways, I hope you found that helpful.